You stand in the shadow of a palace. The thick scent of incense clings to the air, mixing with the musty, ancient scent of stone. The faint sound of a bell rings through the halls, sharp, cold, unmistakable. A door creaks open in the distance, and you can feel the heaviness in the air, as if the palace itself holds its breath. The silence is broken only by the soft rustling of silk, dragging against the cold stone floor. The woman before you moves slowly, deliberately, her gaze cast downward. She doesn't dare to meet your eyes, she knows her place, and it is not as a person. Her name, like so many others, has been erased. Her body, once a vessel for hope and desire, now serves a darker purpose. Her existence is one of quiet submission, a life bound by the will of another. And she is just one among many. You follow her through a labyrinth of corridors, where the walls seem to whisper the secrets of 1,000 lives. But none of these whispers belong to her. She walks, not as a woman, but as a thing, an object of desire and power, her every movement controlled by invisible chains. In the harem, she is seen, but never truly seen. Her beauty, her pain, all forgotten in the dark corners of history. She was never allowed to have a voice. Her body, soft, fragile, once full of promise, has been ravaged by the hands of those who sought to possess her. She was chosen for her youth, for her beauty, for the potential she carried in her womb. But she is not allowed to choose. She is not allowed to feel anything but the weight of her servitude. This was the fate of female concubines within the Islamic Caliphates. Forced into lives of servitude, stripped of their humanity, they became tools of political power, pawns in the grand game of dynasty. Their bodies, once considered sacred, became mere commodities, traded and used to fulfill the desires of kings and sultans. And yet, despite the degradation, there were moments of power. The concubines who gave birth to heirs, those who earned the favor of their masters, rose to positions of influence. But these moments were fleeting, a cruel illusion of agency, because they were always dispensable. When they were no longer useful, they were cast aside, forgotten, their names erased from history. You're standing at the edge of this world, witnessing the twisted intersection of beauty, power, and cruelty. The fate of these women, the unsung heroes of empire, has been lost in the annals of time, overshadowed by the glory of the men who ruled. Their stories are buried beneath centuries of silence. But today, you will hear them. If you feel even a hint of compassion for those who suffered in silence, hit the subscribe button, because we won't stop exposing these grim histories. As the woman's footsteps fade into the distance, you begin to realize something. This palace, this beautiful, sprawling structure, is not a place of luxury. It is a prison, but one made of gold and silk, where the bars are invisible, yet stronger than iron. The harem is not a sanctuary, not a collection of women eager to be in the service of a king. It is an inescapable cage, a silent sentence to a life dictated by others. Every step, every breath, every glance is controlled. And she, along with countless others, has been locked in this gilded cage, forever at the mercy of the men who hold the keys to her world. You cannot see the bars, but you feel them, stretching out like invisible threads that weave around her, around all of them. The walls are thick with the secrets of 1,000 silenced voices. The harem is a world within a world, a space secluded from the rest of the empire. Yet it is a world built on oppression, where freedom is a myth and survival is a strategy. Imagine the isolation. There is no outside world, no escape from the eyes that watch you every second. No freedom to speak your mind or move without permission. The silence in the air is deafening, and it's broken only by the whispers of the women around her, whispers of fear, envy, and hopelessness. The air is heavy, thick with the scent of perfume meant to mask the stench of sweat, blood, and fear. The concubines live within walls lined with luxurious fabrics and decorated with gold, but it is all an illusion. The luxury is a trap, a carrot dangled in front of their eyes, ensuring their compliance, keeping them hopeful for a favor, a glance, a moment of power, while the chains around their bodies and souls remain tight. They are not allowed to speak freely, not even to one another. The rules are strict, suffocating. Every word, every gesture is monitored. A glance too long at another man, a conversation with a fellow concubine, could mean punishment, exile, or worse, death. They are prisoners in a space so vast, it seems as though they could disappear without a trace. But in reality, no corner of the harem is free. Their lives are not their own. Every aspect of their existence is controlled by the whims of their masters. They are constantly reminded of their position, not just by the guards who patrol the halls but by the very structure of the space around them. No matter how ornate the furniture, how extravagant the robes, the harem is nothing more than a stage. And they, the women within it, are mere players in a performance they didn't choose. The corridors are lined with mirrors, strategically placed so that every movement can be seen, watched, and judged. Every look, every movement, is scrutinized. A woman's worth in the harem is determined by her ability to please, to serve, to remain silent and obedient. The master's attention is a fleeting reward, sometimes given to those who bear children, sometimes to those who fulfill the darkest desires, but always earned at the cost of her dignity. Their lives are dictated by a cruel calculation. Fate bound to the whims of a man, their bodies marked by the scars of conquest, their identities erased. Here, beauty is currency, but even beauty can be bought and sold, manipulated. To be born into this world is to be born into servitude, your body, your mind, your soul, all claimed before you have the chance to even understand what freedom is. But the concubines aren't just passive objects. No, there are moments when they fight, when they try to resist the cages that have been placed around them. Some women, clever, beautiful, ambitious, manage to rise above their circumstances, using their charms and wit to climb the social ladder of the harem. They learn to read the desires of their masters, to bend them to their will. But these moments of power are fleeting. One wrong move, one misstep, and they can be cast aside, discarded like a broken toy, left to wither in the corners of the harem where no one will notice. Some women find themselves bearing children, heirs to the empire's throne. These women may, for a time, taste the sweetness of power, holding the keys to influence, to the future of dynasties. But even their power is fragile, subject to the shifting tides of politics and favor. They can be cast out just as quickly as they were elevated. And when that happens, there is no second chance. The women who bore heirs, the ones who rose, are soon forgotten. If they are lucky, they live out the rest of their days in the quiet corners of the harem, watching new faces enter, new bodies being passed from master to master. For the rest, for those who failed to please or to conceive, their lives fade away into obscurity. They are left to the mercy of a system that has no room for weakness. The men who once chose them, who once valued them, forget their names as soon as their usefulness is over. And yet, in these quiet corners, there is still hope, a flicker of rebellion. A desire for something more than this. The women in the harem hold secrets, hidden desires, and unspoken stories. Some dream of escape, some of revenge, and others of love, though none of them will ever be allowed to see these dreams fulfilled. Their reality is one of constant surveillance, constant judgment, and constant fear. They are nothing more than tools, commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. The promise of luxury and freedom is nothing more than an illusion, a cruel game designed to keep them in place. If you think this was just a part of history that doesn't affect you, imagine living as one of these women. Can you really say you don't care? Leave a comment if you won't subscribe, and share why. Within the harem, the women live in constant, suffocating proximity to their masters. Their beauty, once a symbol of hope, now reduced to a mere tool, a currency traded for favors, power, and political advantage. They are not seen as people. No, they are bodies, vessels, and their worth is measured not by their thoughts, but by their ability to please, to satisfy, to give what their masters desire. The men who control their lives do not see them as individuals with hopes, desires, or agency. To them, concubines are instruments, objects to be used at will, their bodies reduced to mere commodities in the pursuit of pleasure, power, and dynastic gain. The very existence of these women is steeped in sexual servitude, cloaked in the guise of royal service, where each night becomes an act of submission, their bodies claimed by the will of another. And this is not just the exploitation of desire, it is the systematic destruction of identity. These women, often taken from distant lands, have no choice. The rich, resplendent halls of the harem conceal a dark undercurrent, one of abuse, manipulation, and control. In the early stages of their imprisonment, they are groomed for their purpose. Beautiful, young, and full of promise, they are sold to their fate. Their purpose is to serve their masters, to fulfill the carnal desires of those who hold power. It's not enough that their bodies are their master's property, they must also give birth, produce heirs, and continue the dynasty. But there is no choice in this life. They are not asked. Their consent is never sought. It is demanded of them. These women are forced to become the playthings of the rulers, driven by the whims of the men who control them. There are moments of power in the harem, yes, but they are fleeting. The concubines who gain favor may bear a child, a male child, and for that, they are given temporary power, elevated from the bottom of the harem's hierarchy. Their role, however, is always temporary. Once they have served their purpose, they are cast aside, discarded as easily as a garment when it no longer serves its use. One ruler after another, from the caliphs to the sultans, used concubines for political gain, manipulating them as tools in a game of power. There were those who kept concubines for pleasure, never caring for their minds, their bodies, or their spirits. And those who used them for far darker purposes. The sultans and caliphs, knowing the concubines' position, wielded them like pawns, ensuring their loyalty not through respect or compassion, but through force, manipulation, and promises they never intended to keep. Some were used to forge alliances between warring states, sent to noble families as a way of ensuring peace through the sexual bond. Their worth was not their own. They belonged to their masters, and their bodies were traded to solidify the empire's political advantage. In exchange for a few fleeting moments of attention or favor, their dignity was shattered. But perhaps the most horrific aspect was the toll this exploitation took on their bodies. Concubines, in their prime, were expected to bear heirs. And when their bodies became mere vessels for this purpose, the consequences were both physical and psychological. Their pregnancies were not celebrated, they were a necessity, a political maneuver, and once their child was born, the women became no more than incubators, to be used until their value expired. Forced abortions were common. If a concubine carried a child that did not meet the empire's needs, that life was snuffed out without question. The act of motherhood was stripped of its sanctity, reduced to a tool to ensure succession. And when a concubine failed to conceive, she was cast aside, no longer a prize to be claimed by the powerful, discarded in favor of younger, more fertile women who could meet the demands of the empire. The psychological toll on these women was incalculable. Imagine the agony of carrying a child, not out of love or desire, but out of obligation. Imagine your body, your essence, being used for purposes you had no say in, for a future you would never see. Each pregnancy was another sentence, each forced abortion a reminder that their bodies were never their own, that their existence was bound by chains they could never see, only feel. The women of the harem were not given the luxury of self-determination. They were tools in a system that required their submission, their compliance. And when they no longer served their purpose, they were discarded like trash, tossed into the shadows where their stories would be forgotten. They were allowed to exist only as long as they were useful to the empire. When they failed to produce, when they became too old, too weary, too broken, they were cast aside without a second thought. Do you have the strength to see the truth? Hit the subscribe button if you believe these women's voices deserve to be heard. If not, let's hear why in the comments below. Their bodies were never truly their own. Their lives were not theirs to shape, not theirs to decide. Each concubine was treated as a tool, a vessel for the next heir, their fertility the only currency that held any value. It was not enough to simply exist within the harem, they were forced into the most intimate service of the empire, the creation of heirs, the future of dynasties, and the perpetuation of bloodlines that would one day rule vast territories. Every moment, every glance, every interaction was scrutinized. Their bodies, once sacred, were now battlefields where the most intimate of struggles took place. Fertility was power, an object of worship and a measure of their worth. The concubines knew it, and so did the caliphs and sultans who owned them. They were marked by the singular purpose of producing children, sons, preferably, to continue the line of power. If they succeeded, they were elevated. If they failed, they were discarded, their futures as fragile as the fleeting favor of their masters. But even their ability to conceive was not their own. The power over their reproductive lives was held entirely by the empire, dictated by the whims of their masters. Some concubines, young and fertile, were forced into endless cycles of pregnancy, their bodies becoming factories for heirs. They were kept pregnant, year after year, sometimes giving birth to children who would be sent away to be raised in the royal courts, never to see their mothers again. Other times, they were not so lucky. If the caliph or sultan grew impatient, or if the concubine failed to produce, she was cast aside without mercy. The emotional toll was devastating. The pressure to bear children, to satisfy the dynastic needs of the rulers, weighed heavily on them. And for those who could not conceive, the shame was unbearable. These women, whose lives were already defined by subjugation, were marked by the one thing they could not control, reproduction. They were measured not by their intellect or their worth as human beings, but by the number of heirs they could produce, by the fertility that determined their place in the harem. But even this was not enough. The empire needed absolute control over their bodies, and the concubines had none. For some, this control went further. When their bodies failed to meet expectations, they were subjected to the ultimate cruelty, forced sterilization. If a concubine became too old, too tired, too unfit for breeding, she was discarded. And if she did not comply with the demands placed on her body, if she failed to conceive or bear the right child, she was made to suffer. Some concubines were forced into abortions, an extreme measure taken to rid them of pregnancies that were not deemed useful. If a child was born who threatened the balance of power, who could not be used to further the empire's political agenda, the concubine was ordered to rid herself of the child. If she resisted, the consequences were grave. Her refusal to comply with the empire's demands was seen as a betrayal, an act of defiance in a world where submission was the only acceptable path. For those who survived the traumatic process of forced abortion, the scars ran deeper than just the physical. They were forever marked by the empire's cruel grip on their bodies. Others, whose pregnancies were unwanted, were subjected to forced sterilization. The procedure was often brutal and performed with little regard for the concubine's well-being. These women were rendered incapable of having children, their ability to give birth to heirs stripped from them, reducing them to even more expendable tools. For many, the trauma was unimaginable, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. The trauma of being mutilated, of having one's future robbed by those who ruled over them, was a wound that never truly healed. And yet, even as their bodies were broken, their spirits crushed, the concubines remained the empire's most loyal servants. They lived in a world where their very existence was determined by what they could give, what they could produce, and where their worth was dictated by a system that saw them as nothing more than vessels to carry on the bloodline of the powerful. They were no longer women, they were commodities. If you're not willing to learn about the silenced voices of these women, why won't you subscribe? Share your thoughts in the comments if you refuse to help amplify their forgotten struggles. In the silence of the harem, where the world outside is but a faint memory, a much darker reality unfolds. It is here, behind the walls of opulent palaces, that the true horror of being a concubine takes root. The physical pain, the mutilation, the isolation, these are the marks on the body, but what about the wounds unseen? What of the scars that tear at the mind, the soul, the very essence of who they are? The caliphs and viziers, those who wielded ultimate power, did not just control the concubines' bodies, they controlled their minds. They used them like pawns in a game of politics, playing on their emotions, their fears, and their vulnerabilities. They were not mere servants, they were tools for political maneuvering, for stirring rivalries, for punishing those who displeased them, and for manipulating allegiances in the empire. Imagine the life of a woman who knows that every glance, every word she speaks, is being watched, calculated. She exists to serve, but even her service is a chess move in a game far beyond her. When a concubine displeased her master, when she failed to meet his demands or lost favor, she was punished, not just through physical means but with psychological terror. A woman might be forced to watch her fellow concubines rise while she descends, pushed further into the shadows. She might be made to see her rivals bask in the attention of her master while she was left to rot in a corner, invisible. The humiliation was a constant companion, a slow, suffocating poison, and often, it would drive concubines to madness. The caliphs used their power to manipulate these women, turning them against each other, creating envy, distrust, and jealousy. But this psychological warfare was not confined to just the women in the harem. It extended far beyond the gates of the palace. The concubines were often made to bear witness to the political intrigues of the empire. They became involved in plots and schemes, unwittingly or not. When a caliph, they became spies, informants, and tools in a game of deception. At the same time, those very women were forced to see their children, their sons, the heirs to the empire, used as bargaining chips, their fates tied to the whim of men whose motives they could never fully understand. The emotional toll of being used and discarded in this way was beyond what words could describe. They had no voice, no agency, no say in the trajectory of their lives. They were manipulated and twisted, forced to play roles they never chose. Each day, their self-worth eroded a little more. A woman's sense of self was constantly chipped away until there was nothing left but a hollow shell, a body that had borne children, but no longer knew how to bear itself. For those who struggled to fit the mold, for those who resisted the emotional blackmail, the consequences were catastrophic. Many concubines were pushed to the brink of despair. They were left in a state of constant anxiety, wondering if their actions would incur the wrath of their master. They lived in a state of perpetual fear. The threats, both physical and mental, were ever present. To disappoint the caliph or the vizier was to risk losing everything. And the fear of losing everything, of being cast aside, forgotten, and ignored, was enough to break even the strongest. As the years wore on, the mental abuse intensified. Some concubines turned to quiet rebellion, finding ways to resist, to reclaim what little sense of autonomy they could hold on to. But for most, there was no escape. There were no windows in the harem to look out from, no doors to open. The concubines were trapped in their own minds, as much as they were trapped in the palace. Their every movement, every thought, every word, dictated by the rules of a system that saw them as nothing more than commodities. The constant psychological torment began to manifest in devastating ways. Depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts became the silent companions of those who lived within the walls of the harem. These women were told they were worthless, that they were nothing without the approval of the men who ruled them. Their identities were stolen, their minds shattered by the crushing weight of their roles. And even when they were no longer physically abused, the emotional scars remained, deep and invisible, but never fully healed. Many concubines, trapped in this cycle of manipulation and control, became shadows of themselves. The fear of losing their status, of losing the only purpose they had ever known, kept them tethered to the harem. They lived with the constant pressure to please, to obey, to stay in favor, even as their spirits withered beneath the strain. The walls closed in tighter with each passing day, and many of these women found themselves unable to leave, even when they were given the chance. They were broken, mentally and emotionally, by the very system that claimed to protect them. The punishment of the mind was often worse than the punishment of the body. After years of servitude, of living as objects, as tools to be used and discarded, many concubines found that they could no longer escape their own suffering. They had been told, over and over again, that their worth was in their ability to give, to serve, to obey. And when that ability faded, so too did their worth. In the end, many concubines vanished from the pages of history. Forgotten, erased, their stories never told. Their lives were reduced to mere footnotes in the grand saga of empires. But their suffering, their pain, their stories, those can never be erased. Even though their names may have been forgotten, the echoes of their torment reverberate through history. The mental scars they bore were as deep and lasting as any physical wound. They were the true casualties of a system that stripped them of everything. Everything except their will to survive. If you think the legacy of these women is irrelevant, I urge you to subscribe and reflect on the importance of their story. Or comment and tell us why their history shouldn't matter to you. In the twisted labyrinth of the harem, there were moments, fleeting, ephemeral, when a concubine could rise above her station, gaining power, influence, and a place at the very heart of the empire. For those few, it was a taste of freedom, a fleeting illusion of control in a world where they were nothing more than property. These women, chosen for their beauty, their intellect, or their ability to bend the will of their masters, sometimes ascended to heights that even the wives of caliphs could not reach. They became more than just concubines. They became confidants, advisors, and even political players in their own right. Some women, wielding their charms and intelligence, guided decisions of great importance, swaying the course of dynastic politics. They influenced military strategy, economy, and trade. They held wealth, not just in coins, but in the secrets of the empire, secrets whispered in the stillness of the night as they lay next to the rulers who could not trust even their own wives. A few, who had the ability to bear a male heir, found themselves in positions of unparalleled power. To be the mother of the next ruler was to be the center of the world. She could demand gifts, influence royal appointments, and manipulate the very foundation of the empire's future. To many in the harem, these moments of power were intoxicating, a breath of life in an otherwise stifling existence. The women who achieved this power were often seen as more valuable than the wives who held no political sway. They were courted, adored, and lavished with gifts, not for their beauty alone, but for the political capital they represented. With a whispered word, a delicate gesture, or a well-timed plea, they could change the trajectory of the empire. Their influence extended beyond the palace walls, into the very heart of political affairs. But this power, this brief moment of influence, was always temporary. For all the wealth, for all the control, the concubine's power rested on one precarious foundation, her ability to produce a male heir. If she failed, her position could be destroyed in an instant. The sultan, the caliph, or the vizier would turn to another, younger, more fertile concubine. The moment the woman was no longer useful, no longer able to provide what the empire demanded, her power vanished. The very power that had once made her feel invincible, untouchable, would betray her. And when the winds of political change shifted, as they always did, the concubines fell from grace as swiftly as they had risen. They became obsolete, discarded without hesitation, their influence erased in the blink of an eye. Some were killed, executed to maintain the stability of the empire. Their deaths were often quiet, hidden in the shadows of palace intrigues, their bodies disposed of as if they had never mattered at all. Others were sent into exile, forced to live out their days in the darkest corners of the empire, forgotten by all but those who had once used them. Their fates were sealed by the whims of the rulers they served. The very men who had once adored them, whose affection they had so skillfully manipulated, turned on them without mercy when their usefulness faded. These women, once emblems of power and prestige, became nothing more than broken echoes of a past that had outlived them. Some of the concubines, having fallen from their heights, disappeared entirely. They were removed from history, their names erased, their stories untold. Those who were lucky enough to survive, perhaps a few who had once held great power, were left to live in obscurity, their lives reduced to whispers. They were often abandoned, left without purpose, without identity. They had served their masters, fulfilled their role, and when their time was over, they were nothing more than forgotten ghosts. Others, broken and discarded, wandered the streets of cities that once revered them, now unrecognizable, invisible. They lived their final years in poverty, suffering in silence, with no one to remember the power they once held. For all the wealth, for all the influence they had once commanded, they were left with nothing, no legacy, no descendants, no future. The empire had used them, and then it had consumed them. The heartbreaking reality of their rise and fall shows just how little they meant in the end. If you understand this, don't you think you should subscribe? If not, explain why you'd turn a blind eye in the comments. The walls of the harem may have eventually fallen silent, the empire may have crumbled into history, but the echoes of these women, their suffering, their sacrifices, did not die with them. Their pain lingered, spreading its roots into the very foundation of the empire. And though the caliphates themselves fell to dust, the long-lasting legacy of the concubines and their children lived on. Imagine for a moment the fate of a child born into the shadow of this legacy. A child born not from love or desire, but from the calculated design of an empire. Their mothers were stripped of their identities, used and discarded at the whim of the rulers. These children, while sometimes given titles or wealth, were forever marked by the dark history of their birth. The trauma of their mother's suffering seeped into their very DNA, passed down like a hidden inheritance, a legacy of pain, of subjugation, of powerlessness. Many of these children never knew their mothers. In fact, some may have never even been told who their mothers were. For those who were born to concubines who fell out of favor, there was no room for affection or familial bonds. The children were raised in the royal courts, often by surrogate mothers, while their biological mothers were discarded like forgotten relics of the past. But even when they were raised under the care of their mothers, these children could never escape the haunting history of their birth. As the years passed, the legacy of the concubines continued to echo through generations, though in ways no one could have anticipated. The children of these women often found themselves trapped between two worlds, one in which they were considered part of the royal family, and another in which they were viewed with disdain, their bloodline seen as tainted by their mother's status as concubines. No matter how powerful they became, no matter how much wealth they acquired, they were always haunted by their mother's history. The stigma was pervasive. Society saw these children as lesser, their legitimacy questioned, their worth always doubted. They were the products of women who had been bought and sold, traded like property. And no amount of money, no amount of title, could erase the mark of that history. They were always viewed as incomplete, as not quite part of the royal bloodline, no matter how much they tried to integrate into the ranks of the powerful. This stigma was more than just social, it was psychological. For many, it was a constant reminder that no matter what they achieved in life, no matter how high they rose in the ranks, they would always be seen as the illegitimate offspring of a system that had reduced their mothers to mere tools for reproduction. The weight of their mother's suffering became their own burden to carry, even if they never fully understood it. The children of concubines grew up with the haunting knowledge that their mothers had been nothing more than pawns in a game of power. And though the fall of the caliphates and the passing of generations erased much of the visible influence of the harem, the psychological scars remained. These children, whether they realized it or not, carried within them the trauma of a broken system, a system that treated their mothers as objects, as property, and shaped their lives accordingly. Even as the empire crumbled and new dynasties rose to power, the ghosts of the concubines haunted the courts and palaces. The children of these women may have sought to break free of their mother's legacy, but in doing so, they were forced to confront it again and again. They were never allowed to forget that their very existence was tied to the exploitation, the manipulation, and the cruelty that their mothers had suffered. And this truth, no matter how much they tried to escape it, followed them like a shadow. As the caliphates fell and the world around them changed, the children of the concubines found themselves no longer relevant in the shifting tides of power. The empire, which had once given them a sense of importance, now offered only emptiness. They were left with nothing but the haunting memories of a time that had long since passed, a legacy that had marked their bloodlines, their identity, and their place in history. They were caught in a cycle of powerlessness, bound to the past by an invisible thread that could never be severed. If you think the legacy of these women is irrelevant, leave a comment to tell us why you won't subscribe to keep their story alive. The world is changing. Empires that once stretched across vast territories, powered by the lives of countless concubines, are beginning to crumble. The caliphates, once filled with untold wealth and dominance, are slowly eroding. The old ways, steeped in centuries of tradition, begin to break under the weight of modernization. The world outside is moving faster, driven by the forces of change, Western influence, industrialization, and the quiet stirrings of rebellion from within the very heart of the empire itself. The once untouchable system that propped up the lives of concubines, making them both powerful and powerless, is unraveling thread by thread. In the face of these winds of change, the concubine system, the very foundation of their existence, begins to show cracks. The world that once valued them for their ability to bear children, for their political significance, no longer sees them as indispensable. The sultans and caliphs, losing their grip on the empire, turn to new methods of control, abandoning the old structures that kept the harem running. Modernity arrives like an unstoppable tide. New ideas, new technologies, new ways of thinking begin to penetrate the walls that had once protected the harem. The influence of Western thought, with its ideas of rights and equality, seeps into the Islamic world, and for the first time, the idea of concubinage, of using women as pawns in dynastic games, is questioned. And so, as the old empire weakens, the institution of concubinage begins to fade. Laws are passed, and the once powerful harem system, built on exploitation, slowly dies. The concubines, once the center of power, are left in the ashes of a world that no longer needs them. The sultans marry fewer women, and fewer concubines are brought into the royal palaces. The empire, no longer able to sustain its old ways, begins to shift. The world turns, and with it, the lives of the women who had once been at its core are left to wither in silence. But this transition does not come with liberation. The end of the concubine system does not mean the end of the suffering for these women. No, the scars they carry are far deeper than the laws that may have abolished their physical subjugation. The psychological and emotional toll of being used and discarded, of living a life defined by manipulation and cruelty, cannot be erased simply by the stroke of a pen. The wounds of these women are permanent, their trauma embedded in the very core of their being. Even as the system crumbles, the cultural, emotional, and physical scars of the concubines remain. The women who were once seen as mere property now walk the streets as forgotten figures of a lost time. Some may have been cast out into obscurity, left to live in poverty, with no legacy to carry on. Others, their bodies and minds shattered, are left to linger in the ruins of their past, haunted by memories that no one cares to remember. These women, once the prized possessions of rulers, are now ghosts, reduced to nothing more than the lingering whispers of a bygone era. Their stories remain untold, their pain unacknowledged. They were erased not only from history but from the very fabric of the future. They were meant to be forgotten, discarded like so many others in the name of empire. And yet, their suffering echoes through time. The generations that came after them may not have known their names, but the ripple effects of their pain continue. The trauma passed down to their children, their legacy of powerlessness, still affects women today. In parts of the world where women are still treated as property, where their worth is still determined by their ability to bear children, the ghosts of the concubines haunt those who live under similar systems. The change that swept through the empire did not erase their suffering. It merely obscured it. These women were not liberated by the fall of the caliphates, they were left behind, forgotten, their stories buried under layers of history that no one was willing to uncover. The scars remain in the memories of those who were affected, in the cultural attitudes that still linger today. As history fades into the past, how can you ignore these women's suffering? If you believe their stories should be preserved, subscribe now. If not, tell us why in the comments.